Even if it doesn't end up being protected conduct of some sort, it's still better to be safe than sorry and involve HR. And if the issue's not clear, get outside legal counsel involved to analyze it too, just to make sure that you're compliant, you're not running afoul of any laws and getting into sticky situations.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, or at goodmorninghr.com. The most important election of our lifetime is now more than a month behind us, and we're just a few weeks away from Donald Trump's second inauguration as president. And it will not surprise you, gentle listeners, to hear that the U.S. population is deeply divided on a wide range of issues. From the efficacy of vaccines to whether billionaires should even be allowed to exist, many people seem to have a heightened estimation of their own opinions on these and other political and social issues. And where are all of these people with diverse opinions often meeting? Yes, in the workplace. Joining me today to discuss challenges employers face in managing political and social speech in the workplace, especially in the post-election landscape, is Kacey Riccomini. Kacey is a labor and employment attorney with the Los Angeles office of the national law firm Thompson Coburn. Kacey represents clients in state, federal, and appellate courts, as well as before various dispute resolution agencies. She is also a prolific writer on various legal topics and serves on the editorial boards for Bender's Labor and Employment Bulletin and Bender's California Labor and Employment Bulletin. Thanks for joining me today, Kacey.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be here.
So, obviously, people have strong opinions about a lot of issues. Good for them. But what are the situations where those opinions become a concern for their employers?
It's really where an employee takes something that maybe a political candidate says or an opinion or position that has been kind of incendiary for the general public, brings it into the workplace, and those kind of statements run afoul of other laws. So, there's Title VII, or in California, there's FEHA that protects employees on a variety of bases of these protected characteristics. And some statements that may be made in the political realm wouldn't be appropriate at work. And that's where you run into these sticky issues.
So let's talk about, you're in California, and we've got listeners all over, but often California is the bellwether of where things are going, or maybe it's depending on the other side of it, it's the thing you need to watch out for in your own legislature to make sure that you stop them from doing that. So talk about what California's specific protections are. Then we'll talk about the national ones.
Right. So in California, there's a variety of protections. As I was referring to before, there's the Fair Employment and Housing Act, or FEHA as it's called, and that protects people on a variety of bases, from discrimination, harassment, to retaliation based on things like race, national origin, gender identity, disability status, all kinds of things there. And then when it comes to political specific protections, there are some labor code sections that come into this that, prevent employers from stopping employees from participating in politics or becoming candidates themselves, or trying to control employee affiliations or political activities. And employees also have the right to take time off to vote in California. So there's a variety of protections that California employees have when it comes to politics or political speech in the workplace.
So what's an example of, under FEHA or some of the other rules or regulations of California, of something that somebody might repeat that a political candidate said, or something that's part of a party platform, or just maybe a widely accepted, or popular political position, at least with some part of the population, that somebody might express that wouldn't necessarily violate Title VII or be, a hostile work environment under federal law, but under the state law might cause a problem for an employer. Can you think of anything like that? Is it just redundant regulation?
They're largely redundant. There are some differences. California protects more classes and categories than federal law does, generally speaking. But you could have really a variety of issues that would run afoul of California or federal law. If someone is repeating certain statements, there's from a few years ago, there was a whole quite a bit of drama surrounding the perceived locker room talk and what was and was not acceptable, with some people, contending that certain statements were just fine. But if they find their way into the workplace, it can lead to a hostile work environment. It can lead to claims of gender discrimination. And so, if that is making its way into the workplace, that's something that the employer has to really put a stop to as soon as it comes to their attention, because you're looking at Title VII or FEHA protections coming in.
One of the top hot issues of the last 4 years and the last election was abortion. Mm-hmm. And people have very strong positions on that topic, some religiously based. So you've got religious protections that people are concerned about. But a lot of people see that as a gender-based conversation. Are those the kind of, advocacy or just, whether it's a Planned Parenthood or a right to life or whatever, flag or badge. We need to quit putting flags on people's desks. I think that would make a lot of problems go away. But, that kind of signaling, would those kind of things create unique issues for an employer in California specifically, or maybe under the federal laws?
So in California specifically, it is more difficult. Employees, they do have the right to advocate for certain political positions. It doesn't mean that they can, do it all the time or during working hours when they're supposed to be productive, but they do have a right to be free from interference there. So there are certainly some cases that have found, for example, that employees they had the right or ability to advocate for persons with disabilities or to advocate for LGBTQ issues. So when it comes to a dispute over abortion and whether there should be regulations and to what extent and where those come from, that can definitely create a problem for employers if the employees are not being, let's say, respectful in their discussions with one another, and it's leading to issues or poor statements being made. That situation is one that can't continue, does have to be addressed, but largely the goal is really that people should be able to respectfully disagree if they are going to have a discussion or decide not to engage with it if it's not going to go anywhere positive.
And so when it's a legal issue, when it's this is this person exists in this class and they're protected, and certainly if anybody in leadership or management who, is specifically and strongly, prohibited from engaging in things that are discriminatory, but then their peers are also having those same issues, right? Creating those hostile work environments, and management's got to address that. But what about that speech where it's not in a protected class, but it's just disruptive to the workplace? So, let's just say that, employee A is very pro-candidate A, and candidate B is, other employees are supporting them, and they just want to, advocate, and they get angry, and it gets disruptive because now we're acting like we're online on social media instead of in the workplace. And let's face it, the reason I'm paying you, employee, is to get the job done, not to cause disruption in the workplace and cost me turnover or, make us less harmonious and less productive.
Those issues can definitely come up. I am a little curious in your scenario if the favor for the particular candidate is based on anything that might be connected to the workplace. So at the federal level, there are some protections from, for example, the National Labor Relations Act that protect employees who are engaged in concerted activity. It has to be connected to some workplace issue, but let's say they're saying that they are really pro-candidate, whoever,
and they're pro-union,
because they're pro-union, or they think they're going to get higher wages or something. That could be protected. So it would be a good idea if that issue is popping up to talk to employment counsel before taking any action, just to make sure you're not violating any laws. But if that's not the issue and it's just I like this candidate and it's other employees are joining in, it's going to depend on the context. But if there's someone who's being, another employee being, let's say, targeted or ridiculed, that might be a situation where HR has to step in and talk to everybody about, behaving respectfully in a workplace, how you talk to people, And, to really just knock it off. If you can't be respectful about the discussion, you don't need to have it with that particular person. But, it's really going to depend on the circumstances. It is a good idea whenever these kind of issues pop up to involve HR and to reach out to Labor and Employment Counsel because with these hypotheticals, it's hard to anticipate every issue that there might be, and it's better safe than sorry.
Well, we hear that a lot, that, my free speech rights, right? I've got free speech. This is America. I can say what I want to say. Explain where on a private employer, we can talk about public employers in a minute, but in a private employer, where does free speech really become, especially First Amendment kind of free speech, become an issue?
Well, the First Amendment, and I think I understand what you're getting at, the First Amendment really only protects people from the government. So a private employer isn't necessarily subject to restrictions based on the First Amendment when it comes to employee speech and whether, when it's a political issue and it may run afoul of other laws. So the First Amendment doesn't really prevent an employer from, let's say, enforcing Title VII protections or protections under FEHA. And I believe there's some case law on that I can get you if you're interested, but I think that'd be a snooze fest otherwise.
And then there are, like you said, Title VII. There are cases where people are specifically prohibited from saying certain things in certain ways that would marginalize or cause injury of some sort to somebody because of their status in a protected class, like we talked about. Now, if they're a public employer, state government or a federal government employee, or even a local city, any government entity, the First Amendment plays differently, correct?
It does, yeah.
What's the 30-second, instructions for public employers when somebody says, "Well, I've got a right to say this," because I've got the First Amendment?
Oh, I don't know that I can get that down to a 30-second soundbite, but no, it's really, I would recommend if there's an employee who's pushing back, whether it's public or private, and they're saying, I think I have a right to say this, get legal and HR involved and analyze the issue. It really is something to be careful with.
And then outside of the workplace, whether it's an employee who shows up at a city council meeting and throws a big fit and on local TV, and they're associated with the employer somehow, maybe through that or maybe not, or they're a part of a public protest and it just happens to be them who's on the news, or maybe just some crazy hot post that they put on social media. At what point can an employer be interested and involved in in addressing what the employee posted or said or how they conducted themselves publicly? A good example would be January 6th of 2021, I guess, the inauguration. A lot of people lost their jobs because they were on the media, at the protest or when in the Capitol or whatever. So at what point is it really an employer concern?
It's going to depend on the issue. So if you're raising the January 6th example, if an employer is seeing an employee, let's say, trespassing onto Capitol grounds where they don't have permission to be there, or they're saying or doing something that may be harmful for the business or violate other laws, then the employer is going to have to, do an analysis with HR, their legal counsel, to determine whether some action should be taken. And there may be circumstances where it's appropriate, but, without the specific case in front of me, it's a little hard to comment on that. But there are circumstances where that can be appropriate, certainly. And there are some cases, in fact, where outside of the workplace, employees are engaged in, let's say, political or other speech. Maybe it's online. And if they're directing it at another employee, or it's being brought to the employer's attention and it's something that might impact the workplace, there are some cases that have found that if an employer does not respond to some of these issues and try to put a stop to, let's say, harassing behavior from one employee to another, even if it occurs on social media, then that can pose some real legal problems for the employer.
And what about the employer just wants to protect their reputation, or an employee who's publicly advocating against the employer's interests?
That one's a sticky issue, and because there's a patchwork of state laws that may apply, I'd actually have to say you really want to run that one by counsel before making a decision. It may be that it's appropriate, if the employee really is damaging the business reputation, then some actions may be appropriate. But given that California has some pretty robust protections, and it's not the only state with protections, but they vary state by state, that's one where you should talk to counsel in that area, make sure that, whatever decision you're making is legally compliant before moving forward.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. At Imperative, we have 3 core values, one of which is always act in the best interest of our client. To ensure we do that, we focus on keeping 3 promises. First, we choose our team's competencies over technology, AI, or algorithms. Our research and the information we provide our clients is always guided by our professional analyst, augmented by, but never substituted with, technology. And second, because our processes are thorough, our compliance is strict, and our staff cares, our clients can fearlessly take action based on the information we provide. And finally, when the phone rings or the email chimes, our team answers and solves our clients' issues immediately with fast and friendly service. These are our promises to our clients, and it would be an honor to extend them to you. You can learn more about how Imperative serves our clients at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 179 and enter the keyword speech. That's SPEECH. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. And now back to my conversation with Kacey Riccomini. So if we talk about discriminatory speech, and I want to have a policy that says that it accomplishes the goals, whatever, what should that policy say to protect the company, protect employees, and make sure we're legally compliant? What kind of things should there be in those policies, or should an employer consider?
When drafting social media or respectful workplace policies?
Yeah.
It's generally fine to have language saying that, we strive to have a respectful workplace. In our discussions, there are certain behaviors that aren't allowed. So oftentimes these policies will have, you can't engage in intimidating behavior or threatening behavior, and that tends to be fine. But the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, has some recent decisions where some of these employer policies were scrutinized, and if they're not, sometimes if they're not specific enough, or if the policy might be read to discourage protected conduct, then that policy might be struck down. That might be a problem. So it is a good idea to run those policies by counsel, have those checked periodically if there are any updates. And usually employers will have respectful workplace and anti-discrimination policies in place. They certainly should. It's a best practice. But it's also a good idea to have the attorneys that you work with on a regular basis just review them on occasion to make sure that if there are any updates, such as the NLRB's Stericycle case, the one I'm referring to now when it comes to employer policies and the scrutiny that applies to those, it's a good idea to run it by counsel. And that may change with the new administration, where previously the NLRB was a bit more employee friendly. And with the new administration, it's expected to be more employer friendly. So there may be some shifts. And it's just a good idea to have someone check and, keep up to date.
And so we have policies. What kind of training ought we have to make these things happen so that we don't have to engage the policies, more, remedial effects?
I mean, generally speaking, you want to have your anti-discrimination, anti-harassment training at regular intervals, both for frontline employees, managers, HR. You'll have, hopefully more detailed training for people who, really need to apply these protections on a regular basis. So that general training is a good idea to have in place. When it comes to whether there's the difference between whether it's political speech or something else. It's going to depend on the employer. If they're a public employer, that might need to be some more specific or different training compared to a private employer. And, with the private employer, the focus is really going to need to be on what is the behavior that is being addressed? What is the problem? Does it run afoul of these laws? How do we address it? So, the focus really isn't, is it a political statement or which party, does it favor or not? It's what is the behavior? Are we looking at a potential violation of FEHA or Title VII? And how do we address this and move forward?
And so, employees aren't the only stakeholder. Companies have customers, shareholders, regulators. We've kind of touched on some of the regulators. How do you walk that fine line between, let's assume nothing's overtly illegal with what's being expressed, but we need to walk that fine line because I've got public perception, I've got customers who might care about, we've seen that where companies and even individual support for institutions and stuff have changed because of those companies' political stances that they've chosen to take. How do those considerations play into how a company ought to respond to speech?
I wouldn't say that they do directly. So again, the real question here is, what is the conduct that is the concern? Does it violate any laws, and how do we address it? It's not, we've taken, some position publicly, and that might be a good or bad PR move. That's not necessarily a legal issue. Mm-hmm. So, reasonable minds may disagree on that one. But when it does come to something that is happening in the workplace, that's when it really has to kick into gear and be addressed.
And the workplace situations, though, sometimes we've seen those situations where they become public, right? So the employer took this action based on this employee's conduct, and it was conduct that outside of the workplace may have been perfectly legal, but now the employer's taking this position and they're getting blowback from one advocacy group or the other, and now they're getting their names dragged through the mud on social media. Is there a way just to say, just don't be a jerk outside of the office? I mean, is there a way for an employer to have a policy that just says, look, we just don't want drama?
I mean, I don't think that that's a workable policy as much as we don't like drama. Unfortunately, we do wind up having to deal with a variety of issues that cross our desks that, we'd rather not. And, workplaces are not in a vacuum. They're not immune from the effects of the real world. And unfortunately, things aren't black and white. They can be sticky to deal with. But something as broad as don't cause drama, I don't think is going to be.
That's not good enough. Okay.
I don't think that's going to be terribly enforceable.
So 5 years ago, it's hard to believe it's been 5 years. I mean, most of us were all in the office all the time. And now we've got remote work and hybrid situations. With people working out of their living rooms or their home offices, how has that changed employers' relationship to employee speech? And how, does that make it more difficult to monitor? Are there more instances, or are there more opportunities or fewer opportunities maybe for employees to bring offense? Or is it just a different way of communicating altogether?
It's mostly a different way of communicating, but when people do work remotely, there tends to be, a bit less of the interactions you would have in passing with people, the water cooler talk. So there's a little less interaction, and a lot of it can be tracked because it's by, a Zoom meeting or by invitation, whereas in the workplace, there's a lot of these small interactions that otherwise would go unnoticed.
Is there, in our conduct, our non-harassment policies, do we need to have specific policies about electronic communication, or is just generally don't be a jerk and follow these laws and do these things, respect these classes? Is that enough, or do we need to really address some of those channels that we're using now that maybe we weren't using a few years ago?
I mean, I don't think you need to go into a ton of detail about the method of communication. There doesn't need to be a separate policy that says, these laws also apply even if you're texting or, sending things by email. That, is something that can be an example in the regular policy, but I don't think it needs to be parsed out and have loads of different policies when you have a anti-discrimination, anti-harassment, and anti-retaliation policy already in place.
And let's talk about retaliation, because that's a topic that everything is retaliation to that employee who just suffered some adverse action, right? And whether it's, and often correlation is not causation, but, everybody feels like they've been retaliated against. What really would qualify? Let's just set out what retaliation under a legal term, under a legal sense, really means when we're taking any employee action. We hear that term a lot. So,
the basics of retaliation are that someone engaged in protected conduct, an employee engaged in protected conduct, and that they're in some way effectively being punished for it or discouraged from engaging in that protected conduct. So, you could have a circumstance where an employee sees that something where they think another employee is being harassed and they go report it. And then in their view, the supervisor that they reported hasn't been as nice to them, or maybe, has more cutting comments or something. And they may be reporting retaliation for something like that. And, HR would, hopefully look into and address those issues. But those can pop up really at anytime there's a complaint of any sort.
Yeah. And we see a lot of them where employees are saying it's retaliation, and it may well be retaliation, but there's no protected activity to start with. So it's not under that league, the employee doesn't like the same football team as the manager does. I mean, who knows? But, those kind of things. And they say, well, that's retaliation. Or they complained to their management, not to one another, about they didn't think the pay raises were sufficient this year, or the company's made the stupid decision, and it's directly to management. And so NLRA is hopefully, not engaged there, but those things come up as retaliation. And so those should probably still, when you hear the word retaliation, that should still go to HR, right? Let's let HR really be the arbiters of whether this is something we need to be worried about.
Yeah, even if it doesn't end up being protected conduct of some sort, it's still better to be safe than sorry and involve HR. And if the issue's not clear, get outside legal counsel involved to analyze it too, just to make sure that you're compliant, you're not running afoul of any laws and getting into sticky situations. It's really just better safe than sorry, even if the situation, does seem like it's pretty innocuous and maybe there's some hurt feelings over something that is not protected. It's still better for HR to be at least involved at the outset.
One last can of worms. What about company monitoring of employee social media? So it's not just hey, this, employees, an employee comes and says, hey, this guy posted this on his Facebook and it's offensive to me. But actively monitoring social media, looking at posts, or specifically looking, maybe even using AI tools to monitor for specific kinds of conduct. Where's the line on that? Or are you seeing many employers even interested in doing that?
I'm not really seeing employers interested in monitoring their employees' social media. It would take a lot of time to do. And I guess there could be AI tools that could make it faster, but it's just tends to be a can of worms. There could, on employee social media, there could be a variety of things that they post that they think are more private than they actually are. And it could be disclosures that indicate the employee is part of a protected class that maybe people didn't know about. And so, with that kind of thing, it's better to be careful and not misuse what might be learned from social media. I wouldn't necessarily recommend monitoring social media for employees, but it could lead to claims of discrimination. And also in California, there's some specific protections that employees have from employers getting into their social media. There are some limitations to those protections as well. But for example, employers in California, they can't ask for an employer and applicant's personal login credentials to social media or other websites, or ask the employee to pull up their social media so that the employer can basically shoulder surf and look at what they're posting, and can't really retaliate against employees for saying, no, thank you, to a request like that. But there are some limitations. So let's say another employee reports to HR that they're being harassed through social media by a couple other employees. They're saying some rude things, something along those lines. In those circumstances, it would be okay for HR to say, well, can I take a look at these posts? Can you show me? And so it's okay, in the context of an investigation to request information like that, but that's, one of the limited exceptions. So it's generally best to stay away from employee social media unless, something is brought to your attention or pops up otherwise. It's just tends to be a can of worms, at least in California.
Yeah, well, and just how many cans of, how many headaches do you really want to invite into your employee relations issues? But
yeah,
but when that employee comes and says, this person's posted something that isn't directed to anybody, but I just find it really offensive. Does that instigate an HR investigation every time? Or is it just show me what it is? And okay, yeah, that's nothing we're going to get involved with. We don't care that they think, dog fighting ought to be legal or whatever, whatever there's or that vaccines, cause people to grow 3 ears or whatever it is. Is it okay for HR to say, that's not, not my circus, not my monkeys when it comes to these things that aren't affecting protected classes or addressed to specific people in the company?
I mean, when a complaint is brought up about a post, it's not a bad idea to see what it is the employee is referring to and be able to make the determination of whether it's a problem or not and whether you have to do anything or not. But no, I mean, HR doesn't need to get involved in every little possible thing that an employee might take offense to. There are plenty of things that offend people on a daily basis that have really no legal recourse. They're just part of being, part of a society where we don't like every single thing that happens. It's really the issue is when statements or conduct might run afoul of other laws like Title VII, FEHA, the Crown Act. There are a lot of protections out there to be mindful of, but not every perceived slight is something that needs to be acted on.
There you go. Well, let's wrap it up on that. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining me, Kacey.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcast. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.